What I was going to do first of all is just to explain what the difference was and why 11th edition was needed at all, because that's actually an interesting question. Then I was just going to go through a little bit about the due diligence and why it's become so important, that it flows logical from why the structure of the thing has happened that way. And then I was going to just examine two quick examples of the logical consequence set of this due diligence approach, which might surprise you, which is also covered in the text. So just as a brief history, I mean, the book's been around since about 1996, I think. That's about when Gay joined R2A. I think we've worked out we've been together for 22 years. But what it started off as was course notes, and it was just a collection of techniques. Now what actually happened was, as things went along, we were doing due diligence or risk reviews, and there were at the time for why double-deck suburban trains should have traction interlocking, and why power lines in Tasmania didn't need to comply with CB1 AS 7000, and why the risk management standard didn't work. And what we kept finding was that if, as an engineer, you're talking about high consequence, low likelihood events, that i.e. they're rare, and you have a fight with the financial people over the precautions you suggest should be in place, you always lose. But when the lawyers were standing with you, saying, what are you saying makes sense, it's a good idea, then the force was suddenly with you. So we started off as engineers with legal support, and then in the sort of mid-2000s, early 2000s, we started flipping around, and we led with the legal stuff first, and then supported with the engineering. And every time we did that, we won. So that's why the book had to get changed from a book on risk and reliability to due diligence engineering, because it became necessary to run with that first. But what's then happened is, and it's just a reflection of what I think this is wrong more than anything else, is that we've been sucked, as we get older, into more and more high level, in the sense that what we now do is due diligence has become part of the governance framework. I mean, it's in all Australian legislation, it's everywhere now. Corporations law, directors must pay their bills when they fall due, and they must demonstrate diligence that they have done so. It's obviously the WHS legislation, it's environmental legislation, it's just become endemic. Now, what that means is what the book's actually turned into, because we decided we do diligence engineers about 2000, in the mid-2000s, so we had to produce or modify the text then. The WHS Act came in about 2011, 2012 in most states and jurisdictions. That meant you had to rewrite it to work all that out and put that context in. And what really has happened is it's now gone to due diligence in corporate governance sense. Now what I mean by that is, you see, it's like it's in the front of the book, it's like a triangle, okay? You've got this swirl of ideas that run around our parliaments, and our politicians pick the ideas they think are good ones. And one of the ones they picked was this notion of due diligence, but they picked it up from the legal system. So I don't know if you remember Donahue versus Stevenson and the snail in the bottle example in the UK, if you remember your legal stuff there. But Lord Atkin, it turns out he was born in Brisbane, by the way, before Australia federated, so he wasn't Australian. I don't know what he called himself as a result of that. But he obviously had some fairly egalitarian ideas, and he just made the point, and he did it quite literally when he was making a decision, pulling out the principle. He just said, look, the principle is do unto others. Now, that do unto others principle, it's a Christian ethic, that's been in every major philosophy and religion that I know of since time 2,000 years ago. Right? And he pulled that into the common law, and then our parliamentarians then pulled it into statute law with great enthusiasm in the next 80 years. It took 800 years to get that principle into the common law, and it took 80 years to drag it into Australian statute law, which is extraordinary. You sort of wonder where they're going to go to when you look at it like that. But that then feeds into, they took that idea, it feeds into the acts, regulations, codes of practice, statements by engineer bodies like safety case guidelines, then you get strainer standards under that, and then you're going to get the guidelines. So you've got this huge canopy of ideas. But if you don't get the context right, you always lose. And it's got to be the governance context. In that context, we sort of recognise generally three paradigms of risk, which we find most boards are utterly confused about. There's the business paradigm, which you assume that risk is an equal upside and downside. So you come up with risk appetite statements, which you pick the best project that has the best upside and the least downsides. You have the safety risk paradigm, which is all downside risk, the risk with no prospect of gain, which means you go for zero harm, and try to get boards to understand how they're going to align zero harm with one paradigm And upside, downside risk with the other paradigm is not easy. And then you get the project risk paradigm, and I'm sure there's more out there. And in the project risk paradigm, it's usually a promised, upside promised position, usually by a government or minister or a managing director. You're doing downside risk assessments from the promised upside risk position, which is different again. And for the life of us, we keep getting people trying to put the risk management standard, which doesn't work particularly well for any one of those ones, throw it all together and wonder why the senior decision makers haven't got a clue. And I've got to say, in our experience, they don't. It's just been a frustration. Now, I mean, I could go on forever about this stuff. What I'll do is just give you two examples of, because Lord Atkin was pretty clear you want to be careful about this, the principle of reciprocity, because it has consequences. Immanuel Kant's pretty clear you want to be clear about the principle of reciprocity because it has consequences when you put it in legislation. Let me just give you two possible consequences for you to think about. You would be aware that the bane of electrical regulators in Australia is the home handyman fiddling with the wires in the roof space, doing themselves in. You understand that concern? Happens all over, right? Big problem. The legislation in Victoria, OH&S Act, Electrical Safety Act, wants so far as reasonably practical and stuff like that. But what it means is you have to eliminate the hazard if you can, and if you can't eliminate it, you should reduce it. Because the principle of reciprocity, if you're in the same position in the roof, what duty of care do you think should have been applied? If you look at it from the point of view of what could be done, since in Victoria 2004, it is entirely possible, for those of you who are engineers, you've probably gone around changing your dichroic downlights, which are about 50 watts with nice little LED 12 volt jobs, right? It is entirely possible to wire up the entire lights in a house now using low voltage. In fact, the most likely thing that's going to happen is they're going to put them on the blue Ethernet cables that have power and Ethernet to power on. That's the next thing they're after, right? And all the 240 volt wires could be in the wall. So since the installation of the WHS legislation in most states, and presumably Victoria put out before, anybody who's fiddling in the roof space and dies fiddling around with the lighting wires, presumably next of kin's got a case against everybody who designed it. Because for a new building, putting low voltage wiring would be dirt cheap. It would be easy and would cost you nothing for a new building. Old buildings would be harder. I wanted to give you one more, just to make you think about that. It's in the book, so it's more on your field there. I might have used this one before, but I'll use it again anyway. Yeah, it's a question of whether people believe in global warming. The High Court of Australia has been clear when it comes to defining what a neighbour is, as in the neighbour principle, that future generations yet unborn can be considered neighbours. Now, if that's the case, the question of global warming, whether it's real or not, it's an interesting question, but it's certainly credible, is an interesting question. And so apparently, as far as I can tell, reading literature, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, which is arguable if the degree warms, planet goes up by 2 or 3 degrees, the water in Melbourne will go up about 7 metres. Now 7 metres in a low-lying city like Melbourne is significant.
We would not be standing here.
Well, it was 4 about 10 years ago.
Well, that's what the Greenland ice sheet. Well, that's what the CSIRO said, so I'm not going to argue with them. But it's substantial. Now, the questions for you, following the legal process. Does the Parliament of Victoria have a duty of care to Melburnians? Even the current ones, but like future ones. I would have thought the answer is probably yes. Following the process that's described by due diligence, which is really an options analysis. You say, what's the possibility, what could go wrong, what are options, in the circumstances, what's the best and reasonable thing to do. So, in terms of global warming, what are the possibilities? Well, I can tell you 3 just looking on the internet. The NASA wants to put in space-based sun shields at the Lagrangian L1 point and actually shield the planet with a bit of sun. It's possible. The Cambridge University engineers want to increase Earth shine by squirting vapour into the high altitude, increasing the cloud cover and thereby reflecting more energy away from the planet, which is entirely practicable. The NASA options in the trillions probably. The Cambridge option, which they've actually tried, they reckon probably 20 billion to do it, to actually kill the planet. The cheapest one is one which some American decided to try just by taking a shipload of chemicals out and dumping in the ocean to try it. If you look at the Southern Ocean, every spring you get the upwelling of the nutrients and you get the plankton, then you get the krill and then you get the whales. If you throw from the back of a ship into a couple of places where the plankton aren't, the fertilisers that encourage plankton, you can create a giant bloom really quickly. And apart from the fact that you're going to wind up a few fat whales and other sundry things that might happen, when the plankton's died and they drop, you get a carbon sink. To do that would be less than probably $10 billion, probably $7 or $8 billion, was the last thing I saw. Now, if you look at the Victorian desal plant, which the government put in as a duty of care, I assume, towards the people of Melbourne, to make sure that in the event of another 10-year drought, we didn't actually run out of water like happened in South Africa not fairly recently, which is a reasonable thing to do. Then it is quite practical to do at least the Southern Ocean for the Victorian government out of its own resources now. So, if you keep following this due diligence principle down, the government, under its own legislation, so far as I know, if they truly believe that global warming is a credible hazard, which so far as I know they do, then they should be doing the due diligence analysis that that philosophy encourages, and then ask the question, what it is that you can do about it. Because I've got a funny feeling that just stopping producing carbon won't reduce things in a hurry. It'll be a slow and may not ever go back anyway. The thing is a complicated system. These are the consequences of some of these things, the legislation that pass it. What I have noticed when we do this stuff, we had a very interesting instance of the Australian government solicitor at the Western Sydney Airport. When you put forward a proposition which is consistent with the legislation and has the support of the Australian government solicitor, and it's not what the minister wants to hear,
It gets buried very quickly.
it gets buried. We have found that out to our cost.
But Richard we are putting together a paper on the greenhouse one and the global warming one, and it has been accepted at a conference, so it might be an interesting discussion.
This is the Australian World Engineering Conference on in November in Melbourne. There is a chapter in the book on that subject, if you want to read that. I think I missed a couple of points, but that's all.
Oh, good. Good.